Sol 14. Mark looked up when he heard the airlock cycling, but for once did not move to help Beth get out of her EVA suit. He figured she would understand and forgive him this one time since he was literally elbow deep in, well, he'll just call it fertilizer. He watched though from the other side of the hab as she pulled off her helmet and immediately gagged. "Oh my God," she exclaimed, accidentally smacking herself in the face with her helmet when she instinctively brought her hands up to her nose to block the smell. "It smells like shit in here." "Yes, that's exactly what it smells like in here," Mark replied, more than a little amused at her reaction. After all, he'd been suffering alone for hours and misery does love company. "It's like we live in a porta potty at the county fair," she said, gagging again as she backed up to the wall, as if putting more space between her and his box so crap would actually help. "The smell is in my mouth." "It's in my mouth, Watney." He couldn't really blame her, it was so bad his eyes were watering even with the earplugs he had shoved up his nostrils in an attempt to block out the smell. "Well, I would open a window, except..." He trailed off and arched a brow in her direction. Beth shot him an unimpressed look as she continued to strip out of her EVA suit as far away from him as possible. "If it makes you feel any better, the worse it smells the more it's working." "What would make me feel better is if you told me where the earplugs are so I can shove them up my nose like you did." Mark laughed and pointed to the counter where he had left them. "It's ironic that we brought them to block out Martinez's snoring and now we're using them to block out his smell." "Was Martinez the worst?" "Oh yeah," Mark confirmed, his eyes wide at the very memory of the smell when he had cut open that particular packet. "Something died in that man's digestive system. I hope Beck checked him for that at some point." Beth laughed as she ripped open the packet of earplugs and shoved them up her nose. "It's all bad though. Part of the issue is our high-protein diet, that's always going to make shit stink worse," Mark continued, having had far more time than he would have liked to contemplate about this while he worked. "Once we're eating a mostly potato-based diet, the smell won't be nearly as bad. Of course we'll probably be used to it by then and not be able to smell it at all." "I don't know if that's reassuring, or horrifying," Beth replied, suddenly sounding like she had a cold now that she had closed off her nasal passages. "Did you get the booster wired into the rover's system?" Mark asked. They had gone outside together earlier, but after he had retrieved the desiccated shit left behind by their crewmates, he'd come back inside and left Beth to install the signal booster that she had been diligently working on every chance she had for the last 4 days. "Sure did," she confirmed. "I'd like you to take a look at it next time you're outside, just to give it a second pair of eyes, but it should be good to go once I get the override program written." "You're awesome," Mark praised. "I know," she agreed with a joking grin. "Speaking of, I'm going to go work on the code for the MRO hack now." She glanced down at his container of crap. "In the other room." "I'm doing this to feed you, you know," he called to her, already retreating back. "And I'm very appreciative," she called back. "I'm just going to do that, appreciating as far away from your box of horror as possible." Mark rolled his eyes and shook his head at her, but was amused all the same. He didn't blame her in the slightest, and quite frankly he wished he could join her, because it was about to get even grosser. It was time to add his mixture to the Martian soil he had prepared yesterday, then he had to mix it all together and spread it back out again. He worked as quickly as he could, but it still took longer than he would have liked. But he only had to force himself not to throw up once, so he considered that a win. Once he was finished, he sprinkled what little earth soil he had on top of all it and took a step back to survey his work. "Godspeed, little bacteria," he said, giving the soil a half-hearted salute. "We're depending on you." Even though it was more work and they had to build the plow to do it, he was glad they went after the dirt they did and not the loose, coarse sand that was further from the hab, but would have been easier to move. Once it was infected with all the needed earth bacteria, it would make far superior soil for farming than the sand would have. Having done all he could do for the day, he went looking for Beth. He laughed when he found that she had climbed up into Foggle's bunk with her laptop. She was literally as far away from the kitchen and their new farm as possible without suiting back up to go outside. Not wanting to interrupt, he stood and watched her for work for a moment while he waited for her to notice him. Her fingers danced across the keyboard at an absurd rate, and she had that little furrow between her brows that he had come to learn meant that she was concentrating hard. After a minute or two, she either felt his attention on her or caught his movement out of the corner of her eye, because she looked up and yanked one of the earbuds out of her ear, the tinny, faraway sound of Daytripper making its way to his ears. "Well, it's up to the bacteria now," he announced, at her questioning expression. "I have about 5 square meters all set and doing its thing. Now we have to wait a week or so and then we can double it." "You're awesome too," Beth said, returning his earlier compliment. "As long as we both know it," he smirked, before he wandered over to his bunk to find a different sweatshirt. Despite the fact that he had been wearing gloves, his sleeves still smelled distinctly of shit and would need to air out for a while before he wore it again. She looked up over the edge of her computer to return his grin with one of her own. "So will mixing the fertilizer with the dirt mellow out the smell?" Mark shrugged. "Sure." "Really?" she asked hopefully. "Probably not," he admitted, as he pulled his shirt over his head and replaced it with another. "I think we're just going to have to get used to it for a while." "Great," she drawled slowly, making Mark laugh. "I see you abandoned your nose plugs though," he pointed out. He'd removed the earplugs from his nose as well, but that was more because they were starting to hurt his nostrils, than the smell dissipating. "I have a cousin who is a homicide detective, and I remembered him saying once that they use VapoRub under their nose when there's an extra ripe body. So I looked through the med supplies and found a topical analgesic that had menthol in it," she said, holding up a tube that was sitting next to her on the bunk. "I put a tiny dab of it on the collar of my sweatshirt and now it's all I can smell." "Want some?" she said, extending NASA's version of Icy Hot towards him. Yes, I do," Mark said without thinking twice. "It doesn't take a lot, which is good since I feel bad about not using it for its original use," she shrugged. "And in case we need it for its actual purpose in the future." Just like Beth had, he squeezed out a pea-sized amount and rubbed it into the neck of his sweatshirt. It would probably stain, but that was the least of his worries. The important part was that the fabric would retain the smell far longer than his skin would. "Oh, by the way, I want to do an EVA tonight after sunset," she mentioned as she watched him breathe deep of the clean minty smell. "You wanna join me?" "Sure," he agreed easily. "What for?" "I want to get eyes on the MRO, watch it come around a couple times and get exact time stamps. I want to be able to do the math so once the patch is ready I'll know exactly when it's going to be over us." "Makes sense. When do you think the code is going to be good to go?" he asked, sidling up to the bunk she was in, looking over her shoulder at her screen. What he saw meant literally nothing to him. He didn't have any problem admitting that the things she could with a computer was practically witchcraft in his eyes. He knew the basics of coding, but what she could do was magic. "I'm shooting for the day after tomorrow," she replied, her fingers still flying across the keys. "Building the booster was the hard part. This is easy. But I want to build a simulation for myself and run through potential problems for a while before we do it for real." "Nerd," he teased fondly, as he walked away leaving her to concentrate. "Don't be jealous that my version of science didn't have me elbow deep in a box of shit all day," she teased back. Mark didn't reply verbally, but he did toss the smelly sweatshirt that he had taken off at her head. "Gross, Watney," she cried as she bat away the offending garment. "What's wrong with you?" But Mark just laughed and left her to her work. XXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXX traveling from south to north, Beth informed him as they stepped out of airlock 2. So I figure we can chill out on this side of the hab and keep an eye out for it. Works for me, Mark agreed easily. It was awkward trying to sit down on the ground with any sort of grace in their EVA suits, but they managed to get themselves situated, leaning against the side of the hab. It made sense to go ahead and get as comfortable as possible since they were planning on being out there for hours. At first neither of them said much, both of them focused on the sky looking for a moving blinking light somewhere on the horizon that would signify the MRO's arrival. They had to be alert because it could literally show up any second, or if they had just missed its passing then it could be 2 hours before it came around again, and they didn't want to miss it. Lucky for them, they didn't have to wait too long, and only 20 minutes after they sat down, Mark's arm shot up, making Beth startle at the sudden unexpected movement. "Is that it?" he said, pointing out into the distance. "I think that's it." Beth followed his eyeline and sure enough there was a little twinkling light heading in their direction. "Yep, that's it," she confirmed happily, as she tapped at the computer on her wrist to record the timestamp. She carefully watched the approaching satellite until it was directly above them and recorded that as well. Now there wasn't anything for them to do but wait, since they had at least 2 hours before the MRO came around again. They sat in companionable silence, both of them lost in thought as they took in the wide expanse of the Martian night sky. "I like that all the constellations are the same as at home," Beth said softly, breaking the silence some time later, leaning the back of her helmet against the edge of the hab as she looked up at the stars. "It's nice to see something familiar," Mark concurred, "even if they are all in the wrong place." Beth hummed her agreement as they watched the constellations wheel across the sky in different paths than they were used to, since the north and south poles of Mars were oriented differently than on Earth. "You realize we're the first people to be seeing this," Mark pointed out a few minutes later. It was against NASA protocols to be outside of the hab once the sun went down. It was deemed an unnecessary risk. "I hadn't thought about it," Beth admitted. "Okay, that's pretty cool." "First," he grinned, holding out his hand for a fist bump. "Come on Johansson, don't leave me hanging." "First," she laughed, bumping his knuckles, and exploding away from it. Boom. "I don't know if I'll ever get over how bright they are out here," Mark mused a little while later. "Talk about a complete lack of light pollution." "You've got that right," she smirked. "They weren't even this bright when NASA dumped us in the middle of nowhere, Nevada for 2 weeks during training. But they were pretty bright when we were on Hermes though," she pointed out. "Yeah," he agreed. "But there's just something different about being on a planet and looking at the stars than being out amongst them." She considered it for a moment. "I see where you're coming from. Plus if I tried to stargaze too long from the Hermes while we were rotating, I'd get dizzy after a while." Beth chuckled lightly. That was a mistake they had all made at least once. After they had gotten their so-called sea legs, it was very easy to forget that you were actually spinning while you were in the centrifugal portions of the ship. When you're in gravity, up is up and down is down. At least until you try to pick out a fixed point outside the window. Then your eyes pick a fight with your inner ear until your stomach is the one that suffers for it. "I feel like we need a campfire and some s'mores out here," Beth mentioned, thinking back to bonfires at the beach when she was growing up. "Or brown sugar baked apples," Mark added, thinking to his own family camping trips in the woods as a kid. "What are those?" "Oh, they're awesome," he said, practically salivating at the very memory. "You core out an apple and then fill it in with brown sugar and butter, then you wrap the whole thing in foil and stick in the fire until it cooks all the way through." "That sounds amazing," Beth agreed. "It is. The apple just absorbs the butter and sugar and turns it into pure delicious," he continued. "I always used to burn the shit out of my mouth every year when my parents took me camping because I could never wait long enough to let it cool before I started eating them." Beth laughed, having no problems believing that. "I'd love to try that," she said sincerely. "We'll have to go camping when we get back to Earth so we can make them." "Are you sure you're ever going to want to go camping again?" Mark asked, amusement clear in his tone. "This is already basically the worst camping trip ever. We're isolated, more than just a few miles away from civilization, living in a glorified tent, eating dehydrated food." "I see your point," Beth shrugged. "But I always felt like this was more Gilligan's Island in space. A 3-hour tour that went terribly wrong after we got caught in a storm." "Okay," he conceded, "you win that one, Mary Ann." "Mary Ann!" Beth exclaimed. "Excuse you, but I am clearly the professor in this scenario." Mark chuckled at the honest offense in her voice. "Is that right?" "Obviously. I mean, I am the one who is trying to make a radio out of 2 coconuts and some fishing line." She was so serious about it, that he laughed so hard that he was afraid he was going to pop a staple again. As it was, he almost tipped over where he sat. "Okay, Professor, so who am I then?" he asked once he had calmed down enough to speak again. "Oh well, that one's easy," she said, attempting to sound serious, but unable to keep the humor completely out of her tone. "You're Gilligan." "Gilligan," it was his turn to exclaim. "How am I Gilligan?" "Trust me." He couldn't see her smirk in the dark, but he could definitely hear it. "You're definitely Gilligan." "Would you rather be Ginger?" she offered teasingly. "I mean, your Oz Live videos did go viral. And let's not forget your very impressive Under Armour commercial." Mark couldn't completely withhold his groan at the familiar ribbing. Sure, the whole crew admitted that the commercial had actually come out really cool, and were excited for him when they saw it, but that didn't stop the teasing. going so far as to text or call him every single time they saw it on TV in the months leading up to their launch. "Well, what about you, little miss? My poster outsold the rest of the crews combined," he countered. "Sounds Ginger-like to me." "Not combined," she corrected, rolling her eyes. "And this isn't about me, it's already been decided I'm the professor. This is about you, Gilligan /Ginger. Oh look, here comes Phobos." Mark pointed towards the western horizon where Mars's larger moon was rising, not even trying to hide the fact that he was blatantly changing the subject. Beth laughed at Mark's avoidance, but let the subject go. For now at least, they had plenty of time to revisit it in the future. Instead she watched the oddly shaped moon rise for a few minutes before she spoke. "Do you think it's going to crash land on the surface or break apart and form rings around the planet?" she asked curiously, referencing the fact that Phobos was caught in the planet's gravitational pull and was moving closer to the surface with every passing year. "Rings," he replied without hesitation. "At least I hope it does. How awesome would that be?" "I know, right?" she agreed enthusiastically. "Can you even imagine what that would look like from the surface?" "So awesome," he grinned. "If you're not busy in a couple million years, we should totally road trip back here and check it out, see it for ourselves." Beth laughed. "Yeah, okay, I'll put it on my calendar. I'm going to hold you to it." "I'll make sure to keep that week free," she assured him. "Now start paying attention because the MRO should be coming around again soon."